welcome back to day 2 of Ithacon. We're so excited to have you here. This morning, we're met with Michael Watson, who is a comic writer of Ithaqa comic. Michael writes for a comic series, Ithaqa, which is set in Ithaqa during the Roaring 20s. Readers with an attention to detail, or historical detail, will appreciate the faithful recreations of the Wharton Silent Film Studios, Cornell University, and underground speakeasies of Ithaqa, New York. All used as a backdrop for a story that takes place at the beginning of Prohibition and women's suffrage. Thanks for being here.
Glad to be here.
I'm just gonna start it off with a heavy-hitting question. How is this different from other Lovecraftian stories, and what inspired you to write it?
So I would say a number of things, I think, set it apart from kind of traditional Lovecraft, as many fans would know it. One being a focus on a group dynamic. Typically speaking, in a Lovecraftian horror story, there is one Ivy League educated, kind of loner genius character who is very reasonable and understands that, logic and reason are the only things that matter in the world. And they kind of are slowly driven mad by the world and a cult or an evil entity or something, or a terrible family that shows them actually there are ghosts or aliens or zombies or rat people or what have you. And so one thing that I immediately kind of changed about that formula was that I'm a huge Lord of the Rings fan, and I very much enjoy fellowship kind of dynamics. I wanted to tell a story about many different people kind of coming together, working together, playing off of each other in a Lovecraftian framework, which is not something that you often see. Additionally, Lovecraft, was alive and writing in the 20s, and so multiverse theory and time travel weren't necessarily things that were in his kind of wheelhouse of knowledge. A Lovecraftian horror story is often cosmic in scale. He was very afraid of how big the universe was, and so I felt that if he knew about multiverse theory, he would be even more afraid of how big the universe really is. And then lastly, just something that I think visually I find interesting and thematically interesting to explore, we bring a heavy dose of psychedelic cosmic horror to his genre, and he was definitely not someone who was experimenting with colors or LSD or what have you. So I think those are 3 kind of easy entry points into kind of how we're starting to change and update the Lovecraftian genre, which you see in a few other kind of cool films, like The Color Out of Space with Nicolas Cage, Lovecraft Country on HBO. It's fun to kind of see this new renaissance of updating a 100-year-old horror sci-fi genre.
That's really interesting. So you talked a little bit about how you're bringing a group of people together, but let's focus in on just for a minute, and can you tell me more about the main character, con man Mookie Smits, and what he gets up to in 1920s Ithaqa, New York?
Yeah, Mookie Smits, is he up here? I'm not even sure. As you can see, our later issues, we kind of give every character ultimately time and the light to shine. Yes, there we go. Looking very dapper outside the Ithaqa police station there. Mookie Smits is kind of how we enter the story. He's kind of a very snake oil salesman, huckster kind of character, and is also the character through which we integrate a lot of Ithaqa's silent film history. He's an aspiring filmmaker who left New York to come up to the Wharton studio. This is pre-Hollywood, and so actually in Ithaqa and in the surrounding area, the Wharton Film Studio was kind of one of the places to be as either a filmmaker or as an actor. Famously, many of the famous actors in New York City would ride trains up to Ithaqa, New York to star in Wharton films. And then Irene Castle, a very famous actress, later moved up here permanently because she loved the place so much. And so through Mookie, we get a lot of Ithaqa's local film history as he kind of tries to beg, borrow, and steal his way into the Wharton studio, into a film. And his initial kind of pull into the story is that there's an ad in the paper for spiritualist investigators wanted. And he's a very cynical individual, and he's like, I'll just film a bunch of people jumping at their own shadows in the woods, call it a film, and we'll be set.
Yeah, there it is.
And a bit of a lush. He's a bit of a lush, which is hard for him because Prohibition has just started, and his favorite bar has turned into a tea shop, and that's just not his favorite thing.
Wow, so we've got film, we've got comics, we've got Lovecraft. So how do you take all those elements and use it to update that Lovecraftian format you kind of talked about in that first question?
I guess it's not something I do so consciously. I just, things that I like or I'm interested in kind of just naturally find their way into the comic. I kind of think there are like kind of two schools of writing. There's kind of like the George R.R. Martin style where you, like once you finish a sentence, it's perfect and you move on, and then you take years to make a brilliant masterwork. Then there's kind of like a Stephen King style of writing, which is very like you think of a situation and you ponder it. You keep asking what happens next, what happens next, what happens next, and you don't actually have a large plan going into it. And I have tried the George R. R. Martin method, and all of those kind of books became kind of like, I don't know, dead in the water for me, where I would meticulously plan, the entire arc, every chapter, every character, and I would start writing it and it just kind of felt dead to me because I don't know, it was like connecting the dots. It didn't have life to it. Whereas this version, which is not necessarily, I'm not saying one way is better than the other, because I've definitely had problems doing the kind of like what happens next method, where I've I've spent years on some issues because I've been trying to railroad my characters in one direction, and then I realize a year and some change later, actually, this character should die right here, and that wasn't the plan. And so it's definitely a very evolving and living process, which has ups and downs. Ups being that it feels exciting to me because I feel like I'm discovering and mining the story as I go. Downsides, at one point, I had finished the entire book. It was like 600 pages or more, and I received some really, really good feedback and ended up throwing out more than half of the book, including a lot of art that I had paid for. And so that was a very costly and painful lesson to learn. Pros and cons to both.
How do you approach like something like that? You write 600 pages and like the feedback is good and you want to incorporate it, but like as an artist and a writer, how do you handle that?
I think I originally got my start in filmmaking here in Ithaca at the Park School, and I think that the filmmaking mentality is a very collaborative one, which has probably helped me transition into writing comics. Because I don't have kind of like I am the god, king of my castle concept of my story. I very much value feedback, because I definitely can write an entire issue and think it's great. I'm like, I'm laughing, I'm smiling, this is so fun. And then my editor will be like, this is just like a bad Joss Whedon episode. And I'll be like, oh shit, you're so right. this is not my style actually. And so sometimes I kind of get lost, down a rabbit hole, and having other people to kind of correct you along the way or kind of to provide honest feedback has been very helpful. And so, for example, Harvey Bolton is this guy kind of very upset in a bad place right now, having a very bad trip. And he is a World War I defector who was kind of experimented on and tortured in France in World War I by one of our villains. And it's warped his kind of perception of the world, of life. He's like, there is no God and everything's terrible and I hate everything and I live basically mostly for revenge and a little bit for love. Spoilers. In my initial draft, this kind of 600-page book, he was just kind of like a cool dude who like showed up and knew what was going on and knew what was happening, and there was no dramatic tension there. He just was like, yes, I've seen this before, and it was like, it was kind of cool to write if you love, I love film noir and pulpy things, but dramatically he had no arc. He was just always right, and it was very boring, and I was like, why isn't this working? And so a publisher, Soaring Penguin Press, shout out to them, gave me a great piece of advice as a writer, which was that if something accidentally happens to your characters, it should always be to make their life worse, not to like make things easier for them. And so unfortunately for Harvey, things get really bad for him, and that became dramatically very interesting. That was actually issue 4, the one that is probably the most colorful that you can see here, is an issue that took me over a year to write, 28 different iterations at least. And a big part of that was because he was just kind of going into this space and like learning information, but he wasn't, messing up. He wasn't causing problems. And when I realized that, he was a man entirely built for revenge. It's kind of his whole thing. And he was just kind of passively watching, the object of his, anger get away with something. And it's embarrassing, but it took me about a year to realize he actually would not just sit and watch. He would just make his move, even though it's the wrong move, and go and try and reveal himself and kill this person who has wronged him. And when that clicked, the entire issue clicked. I wrote it in like 2 weeks because it creates a series of chain events. Harvey is going to attack William, which means he's going to blow his cover, which means there's going to be a fight in the basement of the church, which means horrible entities are going to become aware of their presence. And just at that point, it wrote itself. So Yeah, I think I strayed from the original question, but that's that.
No, I think that's great. And I mean, we've met Harvey, and I know and I'm sure the audience would just love to hear a little bit more about the other kind of characters that Mookie meets throughout the series, and what they get up to, and what inspired you to write them, and who they are.
Yeah, we have a huge ensemble cast, which initially made it very hard to write the first issue because I had to introduce so many characters and give them all a distinct voice and a distinct kind of needs and wants and personalities. So we have Hazel, who is an artist. She's on the right with the red hair and the flashlight. We have Margaret on the left, who is a suffragette who's just kind of won the right to vote. And is trying to figure out what to do with her life now that a movement she spent years organizing in has come to fruition, and she's not very fulfilled in her job as a telephone operator. It's kind of hard to be like, I am part of a moment in history to now just like a boring day job. And so she's trying to extract meaning from her life, and right now she thinks that like mysteries and being a detective is that. We have Rosemary Jones. She's over there with Harvey in the wormhole. She's a jazz singer who has similarly been kind of hurt and tortured by the Church of Flickering Ascension. And she has concocted a very tight revenge plan as well, which Harvey may or may not screw up, but given what I said about issue 4, he does screw it up. We have Ruth Adler over here talking to Mookie. She's a nurse, having recently kind of been through the trauma of the Spanish flu in the 1918 and beyond. And in the 1910s, 20s, even up to the 60s, it was very hard to get a legal divorce from your husband. And her husband has a gambling addiction and is cut out. And so she's saddled with the debts, and she can't even legally divorce him because he's not dead. So those are kind of the characters. They all came from... So there's a great game that I love to play called Call of Cthulhu, which is very much like Dungeons and Dragons, but spooky, and your characters.
Great game, I love that game.
Yes, your characters kind of go insane rather than like get stronger, which is a fun dynamic. And this whole thing initially started off as a short film idea, then a feature-length film idea. And I realized it was too big for me to ever actually, maybe not ever, but in the near future have a budget to pull off psychedelic wormholes. That's not my wheelhouse currently in the live action realm. And so unable to actually manifest that into a film, I kind of turned to comics and, I did turn to comics, but I also started to write it into our kind of Call of Cthulhu sessions just to kind of see what would happen. And so many of the characters, though not all of them, have glimmers of a character that a friend of mine, at the table would play. And so that's part of why I think it's such a kind of fun, diverse group of characters, is that, I have a very fun group of friends, and that kind of helped start that seed that kind of later developed into these characters that are now wildly different from where we started. Because, spoiler alert, when you're drunk and playing a board game, that's not really good fiction, but it's definitely a good jumping off point for good fiction.
Wow, I bet that's just like such a fond memory that you have. I'm gonna ask a really hard question. Mm-hmm. Who's your favorite character to write? It might be an easy question, I don't know.
That's tough. I would say a character who I think is interesting to insert into different scenes is Hazel, who is she's the flapper artist on the right with the hat and the red hair. She has a very kind of peppy, borderline naive, but kind personality, and she kind of gets into, I think, silly antics, and it's really fun bouncing her off of other characters and seeing, who gets along with her, who doesn't. There are whole issues with Harvey, who's a very, sour, like Batman-y, like revengeance kind of guy, and to have him being forced to interact with Hazel, who's like, no, there is an ultimate good, and like, we're gonna figure this out, I'm positive. It's like, it forces. And it's funny because he kind of occasionally finds himself smiling in spite of himself, where he wants to be kind of like a grim, dark dude, and then she's just kind of too infectious, to ultimately, totally push away. And then you have, she's also a bridge between, I would say, Mookie and Ruth, and herself and Margaret. Margaret is very much kind of like, a very proud individual. She wants to solve the mystery, prove that she's got, worth and these kinds of things. And she does not like Mookie and Ruth, who she perceives as kind of like just here for the money, just here for a quick buck, probably a con artist. And Hazel is just a very kind, friendly person. And so she finds things to enjoy in both Mookie and Ruth. And so it's because of Hazel that, Margaret is kind of forced to kind of keep interacting with these people who she kind of deems unserious. So I don't have a favorite character, but I very much like putting new characters in a room with Hazel and seeing how they change because of that.
Oh, wow, that's really interesting. So, in a world where possibilities are endless in the space-time continuum, how do you focus your storytelling down to just one comic issue at a time when there's just so much you could do?
Yeah, that's part of why this is taking so long. One of the reasons why issue 4 took over a year to write was because I couldn't quite figure out the dramatic tension with Harvey. Another is that once you kind of enter the time travel multiverse kind of realm, you open just like an infinite amount of potential plot holes that you can step into. If, for example, the Book of Seams, I don't know if that's pictured up here, but if there's a very important, dangerous book, and it's like a linchpin to something, why would the big bad guy who is omnipotent and can kind of at least think across time, why would he allow it to exist or stay here or what have you? And on one hand, the multiverse theory kind of allows you to do time travel in a way that's not so crazy, because in a multiverse kind of framework, you can't like go back in time into your own timeline and prevent yourself from being born. It's like if I go back in time and like, I don't know, push my dad off a bridge, I have now created a new timeline. And so I come back, my timeline is unchanged, but I've now created a timeline where I never was born. So on the one hand, the multiverse framework helps you not get into like, Back to the Future kind of paradoxes. On the other hand, you have to figure out how do you create a narrative where people care. If you watch like Rick and Morty, for example, there's like this nihilism kind of in the show, especially in Rick, where he's like, there are infinite universes, infinite grandsons, infinite people I care about, so nothing matters. And so part of this comic is me wrestling with that kind of like mentality of like, how do you think anything matters in like a infinite universe, and there are infinite versions of you and what have you. And so I'm trying to imbue a sense of, well, it matters to you personally, and so therefore it has meaning into this story. And so even though there may or may not be parallel timelines going on in this comic, I think by issue 5 we do confirm that there are, I think that people care enough about the characters that we have small moments with them, where they're kind of scared in a basement and kind of hugging each other, or Mookie's finally getting a break with the film, maybe. So, and I kind of consider alternate timeline versions of characters to be separate characters. There's Mookie A, there's Mookie B, and Mookie A, life has not yet broken him, and so you care about him for that. But then Mookie B, things are not going very well for him. You have empathy for him too, because he, you kind of can see the contrast of how his life could have been otherwise. So yeah, I don't know.
No,
I'm trying.
That's a great answer. You actually, it kind of spurs my next question. You said you're trying. You said it took over a year to write issue 4. Is that correct? How do you keep going as an artist? How do you keep yourself motivated when something's not maybe working out the way you thought it would, or it's taking a lot longer than you thought it would? How do you keep going?
Having an editor was really good. A friend of mine who I pay to be an editor per issue was really important, because there's someone who I feel I'm accountable to, and vice versa. So it's not just kind of me reading something and thinking it's good enough, or hoping that one of my friends will come and read a huge manuscript. I have someone who has read multiple versions of every single issue, knows it about as deeply as I do, and so when I say a new idea about like what if there's this thing called the one in red, she could kind of be like, yes, that sounds interesting, but have you thought about this in issue 5 when blah 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 happens? And going back and forth with Lisa, my editor, for issue 4, I would have probably paused or quit the series in issue 4 if it had not been for her, because I felt like we were both working so hard on it that I really owed it to her to finish. Because I started this 5 years ago, and so maybe this is like year 2 or 3 was issue 4, the script. And in my head, I was kind of like, well, we've got 3 issues. We'll see if they do really well or well enough. And if they do well enough, we'll keep going. But if no one cares, then we'll move on. When you're a self-publisher, it's very hard to break out and kind of get enough readership to justify paying artists hundreds or thousands of dollars, not $100,000 to make a series that is just kind of going nowhere. It could be seeming like, and yet Lisa and I were both working so hard to kind of fit the plot holes, or remove the plot holes and kind of like create tension, that it really motivated me to finish. And once I finished it, it actually became one of my favorite issues, and it's actually the highest reviewed issue so far. And I think actually might be kind of like a watershed moment for the series, where we kind of step away from just kind of a very traditional visual aesthetic into something very unique, because there's not like a lot of 1920s wormhole psychedelic comics out there.
No, not too many. You mentioned self-publishing, so I'd love to pivot this conversation a little bit, and let's talk about your use of like Kickstarter to help create this project. How does it enable you as an artist to do what you do, especially as a self-publisher?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wouldn't be here without Kickstarter, no doubt. I think at the single issue level, Kickstarter is very approachable, because you're asking for, maybe depending on if you're your own artist or you're versus a writer, you could be asking for hundreds or like a few $1,000s, which is something that you can make happen. And it also becomes kind of a megaphone to reach new people you haven't met. And so, if you are able to, for example, fund, within like the first day, Kickstarter goes, ooh, we're getting paid. Let's bump this one a little higher up, in the algorithm or what have you. And so all of a sudden, people in like Sweden are like checking out your comic, and Australia and other places. And then you also get emails, very crucial to any aspiring writers, artists, whatever. The email list, it's old school, but it is like one of the most valuable things you can do, or have, I should say. And so Kickstarter kind of keeps that very organized for you. And then also, has a very passionate community. People who love comics on Kickstarter want to see other comics succeed. They want their own comics to succeed. And so there are people who are constantly kind of just like scrolling and looking for new things. And so it's for people who kind of are looking for, it's very intimidating to think, how do I create a new intellectual property and launch it by myself? I think Kickstarter is definitely not like the first step you should take. You should definitely kind of be on TikTok or Instagram, etc., kind of building a few people. You want to have some people who you don't know checking out your page before you go all the way up to the, can you give me money stage? But it's also nice that Kickstarter is kind of like a no-risk situation ultimately, because no one gets charged if you don't make the money you need. So like the kind of mistake you could make with Kickstarter would be to kind of, think, I'm gonna, pretend I only need $500 when I need $1,000. And you're gonna be like, oh, I got backed, yay, and then you don't actually fulfill the thing that you did. People get upset, you could lose that trust, you could lose that community. But as long as if it takes $10,000 to make something, and you raise $10,000, you can deliver it, and you can kind of bring in new people. And that's worked out for me 3 times so far, so would recommend. TikTok has also been really big for us. My artist Teresa has just officially monetized her account, and so she's like already way past me on the writing side of things. So I would recommend that as well.
What was that feeling like when you got that Kickstarter Project We Love notification?
That was very validating, because it's very easy as a creative person to kind of assume that the only people who are looking at your work are people who you personally know, who are like put it in their hands, like your parents, your friends, your relatives, etc. And I think it was our second, maybe it was our first Kickstarter, I can't remember now, because we've gotten it a few times now. When that kind of like came through, it meant that someone who worked at Kickstarter found our project, saw the art, saw what we were doing, and was like, this is actually like very valuable. This is not just like, some weird fan project. This is not a scam. This is something that we really want to bump up to the front page of the comic section. And that really helped kind of build a degree of confidence in me that like we could kind of keep coming back to the platform, keep asking people for money ultimately, because it's hard to, this is before we even had reviews in as well. And so you're kind of just, as I mentioned earlier, I kind of can very easily get into the weeds of what I'm doing, and I can kind of lose all sense of like, is this good, is this bad? And having a source that you respect validate you is a great feeling, so yeah.
Oh yeah, I could imagine, like, I'm a filmmaker as well, and so it's just that feeling of people in your community or outside of your community that actually see your work. You're like, wow, like I'm actually making a difference here. And on that note about community, you spoke briefly about this, about your experience with Kickstarter, but I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about like using platforms like TikTok or Kickstarter to connect with like readers and funders, and how you build that community and what it's like interacting with people that might not be your parents or your friends.
Well, I would definitely recommend whatever like medium that you're using to kind of break the thing that you're doing into smaller pieces than you might intend and dribble it out, over long periods of time. Because this is very much like I don't know, number scheme is the right word, but it is a long slog to kind of reaching a community that can support you. I remember on some YouTube, someone kind of said, you need like 1,000 super fans, basically, in order to quit your job and do the thing that you want to do. And I'm not there yet. I've got probably we have hundreds of readers, but we don't have 1,000 super fans yet. And so, and a lot of people I see on other platforms will kind of do a big dump, of this is 10 pages, this is 50 pages, this is the whole book, this is, every track on the album, etc. And because you feel like it's epic, it flows into each other, and it should all be experienced as as this longer piece. But the fact is that if you're starting from zero, then no one's going to see it, right? And so you need to kind of consistently put something, little piece out every every week, every day, whatever you schedule you can manage. And then eventually, you will kind of hit a larger critical mass where people do actually see what you're doing. So we're starting out on this new platform, not new, new to me, called Webtoons, which is kind of for a lot of manga and things like that. And a big part of what that community values is that you're going to be a consistent updater. You're not going to just promise a cool story and some cool art and then forget, for a month and then post 5 to make up for the month that you forgot. It's really about consistency. And so I post 1 page. Even though this is not a comic designed to be treated like a webcomic with a punchline on every page or what have you, what matters is the consistency. And so we've only been doing it for about a month, but we're up to 800 views, which is small but cool for a brand new platform for me. And we got some subscribers, almost 100 now, just kind of experimenting with it. But I'm confident that because I can schedule 1 page a week for several years, that I don't have to do anything. I can kind of just walk away and let that kind of build and check for comments and what have you as time comes along. That'll work. Another platform we used called Peaked was kind of like a cryptocurrency blogging website where I just kind of would post pages and people would give us little tips and in cryptocurrency and whatnot. And that was another thing is every day a different page, a little bit of a thing about it. The consistency is key. And some people kind of burn out. They try to make the whole comic before they put it up, and they kind of go nowhere. So yeah.
So a word I'm picking up on is consistency. As a self-publisher, how do you find that discipline to have that consistency, to do it constantly or consistently?
It's hard. Yeah, I'm really bad at that on Instagram for sure, because I like to use systems that let me kind of do a bunch of work at once and then kind of dribble it out over the course of time. But with Buffer on Instagram, you kind of can only do 10 days at a time, and so I usually, unless you pay for it, and I'm a scrappy, cheap individual at this point in my comic career. And so I guess I gravitate towards platforms that you can kind of have a productivity hour where you upload a month or 2 months of content and kind of let it kind of dribble out. I was freelance as a video editor for a long time and working remote, and so that made it really easy to find time, to be fair. It's not necessarily everyone's situation. I have a great journal that I love to use called the Hero's Journal, which is this little kind of book where you kind of give yourself 3 tasks a day, and you mention who are your allies, what are your obstacles. Usually it's me going down a YouTube rabbit hole. But having just that checklist does really help, because especially as a freelancer or just a person who's unemployed or a person who's kind of really trying to make it work as an artist and they're only doing the art thing, it's really easy to kind of get to the end of the day and be well, I'm a piece of shit. But if you have a list of things at the start of the day that you say I'm going to post a thing, I'm going to work out, and I'm going to cook dinner, and then you do those 3 things, and that kind of dark voice in the back of your head that's you suck, you didn't make any money today, you can kind of go back to your list and be no, these are the things I wanted to do today, and I did them, so the dark part of me is wrong, actually, thank you very much. So I would definitely say lists like that are very helpful for accountability, and also just mental health.
Yeah, I gotta prove that little voice wrong, especially as an artist.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this has been some really great advice. My next question is, do you have any other advice? If you had to give someone who was, gonna start in your shoes, where you were, back at book 1, what's the one piece of advice you would give them?
Always jump in on a new platform the second it launches, even if you don't understand it, even if you think it's dumb, because the fact is that whatever company is trying to promote this thing is putting a lot of money into trying to make it work. And so if you get in on the ground floor, you can usually do very well. And so I remember like when I was at the college, when Twitter came out, and I was like 140 characters or less, like that's so stupid, like who cares about that? And so I didn't even try, and that was definitely a mistake ultimately. Because now I'm playing catch up against a million other people. Granted, Twitter's kind of on a downswing, but the principle follows for any new platform, whether it's TikTok or something in the future that I don't, know or understand. Try and figure out a way to make your content, at least have a home on it, because you're competing with way less people, and maybe you'll get creative with it too. Like I've, on YouTube, we've kind of like live streamed like theatrical productions of the first 2 issues of the comic. And so different platforms, you wouldn't think that YouTube is like the go-to comic book platform, but sometimes bending your art to a new platform kind of makes something fun happen. So yeah, that's the easiest quick piece of advice.
And you mentioned, since we're on the topic of like social media and platforms, like your artist is now monetized on TikTok, which is just amazing because I know that's a really hard thing to do. How do you take something that is so physical, and turn it into like short-term form video content?
She has a way easier time than I do. I'm still trying to figure out what my angle on the Ithaca on TikTok thing is. What she does is, she's an artist, so she draws, and so she shows the process, and she has cool music and fun faces and whatnot. So it's very easy for her, and she's just, as you can see, a brilliant artist. And so she, can decide I'm going to draw every character as a Disney princess and just do it. She can do all kinds of things. Me as the writer, I have to get a little bit more creative. I'm thinking of probably doing kind of motion comics, because I'm a video editor as well and some animator on the back end, so that's what I'll probably do.
And going off of that, we've kind of talked about community a little bit, but how do you find that community on platforms like TikTok or YouTube? Is it all algorithm? Is it, is it up to the ether to decide who sees your content? Or, is it about hashtags? What is it?
Yeah, it's very platform dependent. I guess I'm not different or special in any way, but if you're doing something, you have some very unique, specialized interests. Whether you're making a mafia movie or a concept album or whatever you're doing, like there's some element of it that is very like that's more niche than just kind of like the broad tag of like comic book or music. And so I guess I don't care if a subreddit only has like 1,000 followers. If it's like the cosmic wormhole subreddit, then I will go into it, and you'll kind of get a few people here and there as you go. And so really drilling down into what you're doing and thinking about what is weird or different about it, it's usually a good way to kind of start for finding and going into small communities. Don't obviously expect to like make a wave on like the hashtag comics hashtag on Instagram, because too many people, too much noise. So go to as niche as you can go and kind of build from there.
Yeah, sometimes that less is more. Like everybody wants to go viral, but you gotta find all those little pieces before you can actually go viral. What's next for Ithaca Comic?
Probably going to try and get a publisher or a literary agent this year. I know that we can keep kickstarting if we have to, and that's a good kind of security fallback plan to have, because it's very important to me to finish the series and make sure everyone gets to read it. But it's a lot of logistics to be like, getting print files ready, getting them printed in China or in the US or both, getting them shipped, getting them into comic book stores, restocking all the stores in town when they run out of comics. And it's very limited because I'm just, a person with a car doing it, in like my comfortable driving radius. So I would love to get a literary agent, because their job is to get you a publisher, and they only get paid if they do. And then all of a sudden, a lot of the things that I'm not as good at in terms of like remembering to post on Instagram every day or what have you, no longer become my job. And I can focus more on writing the last issue. I can focus more on working with Teresa to kind of nail the art down. We're working on a card game, which I'm really excited about, probably a year or two out from that actually, being in a beta for people to play. But the second I have some breathing room, I would definitely kind of put a lot more time into the card game, because I'm enjoying it.
Oh yeah, I play. I bet everybody in here would play. It's actually, you sparked another question. As a self-publisher and an artist, how do you balance the art and wanting to create with the business, with having to, sell a product, with having to get it out there?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm trying to think. I I love doing events like this. You know, I love going to Buffalo Street Books and Comics for Collectors, and there's a Little City Books back in Hoboken where I lived for a time. That element is really fun, and also is kind of like the majority of, I would say, my business savvy side. I don't, occasionally I'll, try, ad campaigns and what have you. Kickstarter is like a huge ad campaign for like 3 or 4 months, so I kind of really do go all in on the business. And it does suck because, especially like, when I'm trying to, rewrite issue 4 for like the 30th time, or a more difficult issue, you kind of do have to, at least I have to, given I have a full-time job and what have you, have to put the creative stuff on hold and kind of just spend a lot of time being creative, like in a different way, creative in like the how do I make funny videos for people to enjoy, how do I, what platforms can I get on, etc. I don't love that part. Like I enjoy making the funny stuff, but it's very stressful, to be honest. And you, especially like on Kickstarter, when you're kind of scrapping for like $100 at a time, you kind of, if you don't get there within the first day or two, you have to kind of like really be like, all right, back to the drawing board, time to make up some email lists. Who are people who I know like me but haven't donated yet? Who are what are some press outlets that said, oh yeah, we'll review you, but they didn't follow up, and so now I've got to follow up. And it's a very stressful, hard thing. And I will say that in the comic book space, at least, it's very collaborative, and so I do get to kind of share that burden with my writer, with my illustrator, with my editor. I have a friend who kind of acts as like my publicist, which is really great. And so teamwork makes the dream work when it comes to the business side, for sure.
Yeah, I think you put it in a great way. It is creative, and as a creative, you have to kind of think about the business as being creative. Otherwise, it's just like, oh my gosh, I don't know where to start. But I think, I would love to open the floor for questions if you're happy to answer any of our questions.
Sounds good.
So if anybody has anything they'd like to ask, we'd love to hear from you.
You work with an illustrator, you're the writer, so how do you communicate to her what you want, in the sense of how do you, that's badly worded, but how do you...
But a good question though, yeah. So I'm one of Teresa's favorite people to work with for all kinds of reasons, but the biggest one is that I'm very specific when I'm writing my script. I initially tackled the Ithaca script writing process almost kind of akin to like a screenplay, because that's kind of what I knew, what I came from in the Park School of Communication. But breaking it down panel by panel. One of the biggest differences between writing a screenplay and writing a comic book script, though, is that like when you're making a film, and in the first panel you kind of set the stage. You're like, we're in a lounge and there's smoke and there's red tinted bulbs or whatever. You only have to describe that in like the first panel, because in real life you set up the set and then it's just in the background when you're filming. Whereas in a comic, you have to describe what's in panel every single time. Otherwise, your artist assumes it's not important. And so, I think, well, these are very busy panels. You can tell that I've been very descriptive here. But there are a lot of people who, and there's no really wrong way to do it. Stan Lee famously would kind of just like, draw some stuff, or have Jack Kirby draw some stuff and then figure out the script later. But a lot of people that Teresa works with will just kind of, be like, well, on this page, I was thinking maybe a cool fight would happen. And on this page, maybe they realized they were wrong. And so getting very granular is important for us. And so I write the script, go over it with my editor at least a few times, and we kind of go phase by phase. We start with roughs, which are kind of like, almost like, they're like thumbnails. They're very, very, very rough. And then we move to pencils, lines, shapes, some of the background. We move to inks, which is when you kind of get into light and shadow. And then lastly, colors, the most fun jump in quality. But at each phase, from thumbnails to pencils to inks to colors, we're talking about every single page, basically, where I kind of often feel like the relationship is similar to like a director and an actor, because these characters are my actors, and Teresa is the one expressing their emotions. And so I'll think Harvey's having a really bad trip over there, and maybe the first time she does it, he's like, I don't know, he's not fearful enough. And so then I'll think, okay, well, like he's seeing eyes on the floor and he's really not vibing with those eyes, things like that. And so then we'll kind of riff back and forth until we kind of find a place or performance that kind of matches my vision. And also, a lot of the stuff that I asked Teresa to draw doesn't exist in real life and is springing from my consciousness. And so I create large Google Docs full of images from different things, photos of Ithaca in the 1920s, weird visual designs, a lot of the Venom symbiote. I do a lot of those pictures to kind of describe the rot, goop, and strings that we try to do here. And so, that is the process. We check in on every single stage. It's way easier to change things at the rough and pencil stage than to get to the color stage and be like, actually, I think Harvey should have his shirt on. I'm really thinking that would be cooler. And then, great. Now, at that point, if you're an artist, a very important safeguard to have is to make sure you charge people for edits that are that drastic, that late in the process. Obviously, I speak from a writer's perspective, but if anyone here wants to draw comics, definitely protect yourself from getting to this last stage and then the person realizes, oh shit, there's a guitar in every panel. Can you come back and do that? And be like, I can, but that's $50 a panel. Thank you very much.
That's a great question, and I'm actually going to ask a follow-up on that. We've talked about, your artist, your friend who does publicity for you.
Mm-hmm.
How do you find those people to help you, right? Because it's a team effort,
Mm-hmm.
writer, artist, illustrator. How do you find those people that are going to help you and work with you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a combination of actively, searching. Like for Teresa, I had the scripts ready for the first 3 issues, and I went on, I think it was Spider Silk and DeviantArt, aging us a little bit. And I put an ad being like, I want to do a 1920s horror story, tarot card imagery, etc. And I had a number of people respond, and Teresa was the person who ultimately, who just blew me away with her art style. I had her draw the first page of the comic, which had all the characters in it conveniently. So I was able to kind of see what was her take on, Hazel, Mookie, Margaret, etc. Important, I paid her for the test run. I'm very much in the school of pay your actors if you're in film, pay your artists. No one should, unless it's like, I don't know, like your partner, or honestly, I think no one should ultimately subsidize, your dream or whatever. That's not really fair. You can't I don't believe in don't worry, when I'm big, you'll get 10%. I think that people's labor is valuable, that their art is valuable, and so you should be willing to pay them upfront and for their time. And so that's how I found Teresa. Comic Silk is how I found Lucas, our letterer, whose letters you can't see here right now, but they're very cool. He's invented alien languages for me, so I really appreciate that. Combined with just people who I knew from college. Lisa was an English major and a playwright here, and a film director, or play director, and a great friend of mine. And I just really respected her storytelling and her writing, and I knew I needed someone to kind of be accountable to. And so I was like, would you be interested in, maybe being my editor? I would pay you, like $100 an issue or something starting out or whatever, just some kind of transaction so that we're accountable to each other. Meanwhile, for my publicist, friend also here, Kat from the Park School, and just ran into her at a wedding. And she was like, oh my God, I heard you've been doing this comic at Ithacon, it's so cool, I'm working at DC right now. And I was like, DC, you say? And so, a combination of seeking things out and just, maintaining friendships. I think, not cynically, but just, caring about people is a good way to be. And, having a broad community is a good way to kind of randomly have people kind of turn out to be doing things that are similar to what you want to do, and who randomly decide they want to work with you on something. So yeah.
Yeah, community is just so important in the world of comics. It's just, we've seen it here, we see it all the time. Are there any other questions we have? Yes.
As a writer, given that it took you over a year to write that, was it?
Yeah, issue 4.
At what point do you say, okay, that's enough, let's move on, or this is right? Nothing's ever truly perfect, but...
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you definitely don't want to let, perfect be the enemy of the good, right? And one of my friends has a phrase, as they say in good enough land, that's good enough. With issue 4, and I guess the easiest way to tell that it was time to move on was that I just felt something click inside of me that changed, where I knew that the plot was moving forward. It was forcing new reactions. It was things were flowing into the next. Issue 5, which came after issue 4, obviously. I wrote in 1 week. I was that ready, and issue 4 sets up issue 5 that quickly for me, because if Harvey is stuck in the past, then now Rosie has a whole lot of problems, and blah 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 blah. And so I remember, I want to say it was Stephen King and his book on writing, but it might have been Neil Gaiman. I kind of sometimes get their writing books mixed up. talks about that if you're really stuck in writer's block and you don't know what's happening, you should really investigate, even up to several chapters back, and really think about what these characters are doing, because there's a really good chance that you have railroaded or forced your character into doing something that they wouldn't actually do. And so for me, it was that I had Harvey, who was like, a World War I trained soldier bent on revenge. I had him in a completely passive role where he was just watching things happen. And I was trying to force that to happen because it was easier for me to have him not cause problems, because I wanted to get to the cool monster coming, and I wanted to get to, I wanted to be done with issue 4 because I've written it so many times, It was just, I wanted to just get the important time travel exposition out of the way and move on back to the gang being wacky and doing whatever. And because I was forcing this character to do things he wouldn't do, it was just this wall I just kept hitting over and over and over and over again. And so once I realized that there's just no way Harvey's not gonna fuck this up, it all fell into place. And so even if, every time I go back to the script, I always, will want to tweak some of the dialogue. I'll always think, oh, we should have had the pen or the tarot card on the table. There's always some small detail, but especially when you're stuck on something for that long, you feel it just come out of you. You kind of know and move on. And it also helps to have an editor be we can move on. So I really would recommend writers to, even if you're paying someone your I don't know, your roommate or someone who's taste in literature you appreciate, pay them $25, $100 just to read and be accountable to you as an editor, because it's really helpful to have someone outside of yourself kind of being yeah, I like this, or in the first issue, Margaret and Hazel, they're kind of in the church of Flickering Ascension here. There are rats crawling about. And in my head, it was oh, funny scene, the rats come out and they're oh my God, rats. And Lisa was Michael, they're actively here investigating ghosts. They're excited to meet ghosts. Why would they be freaking out about the rats? And I was oh yeah, they wouldn't do that. And so it's kind of funny because I know my characters very well. They're very alive to me, but it's important and helpful to have someone who, who isn't inside your thought process. Because my thought process is, what a funny scene, I can imagine it, I'm laughing, therefore it's good. And this person just comes to the scene kind of cold, and they're why would they do this though? And so, yeah, those are important tips for writers, I would say.
Very important. I think we do have time for one more. Did you have a question you wanted to ask?
Yes.
Go for it.
So, as you've said, you were a Park alum, and you were a film major as well, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And what I was curious about was sort of the choice to go into comics. Was that a decision made based on logistics, or was it based on a shift in interests, or maybe a little of both?
Definitely both. As a senior, I created what was called then a transmedia thesis. I did a 20-minute short film, not short. I built a website and I did a webcomic all set within the same story universe of my thesis. So it was a kind of anyone's seen the Good Omens show? It was very much in the spirit of Good Omens, where heaven and hell are competing bureaucracies, and the apocalypse gets set in motion totally by accident and by a bunch of idiots and stuff like that. And so the film was kind of I don't know, an origin story, and then the webcomic was a multi-thousand-year jump into the future to the apocalypse, where paperwork is misfiled and all of a sudden bad things are happening. And so the comic, that kind of caught my interest. I've always been a reader of comics. Neil Gaiman's The Sandman series opened my brain to wacky and crazy mythologies, and you really can have Thor getting into an argument with Lady Bast from Egypt, and what the heck, you can mash up religions, that's crazy. And so comics have always been part of my kind of just my I don't know, the fertilizer plot in your brain that kind of grows things. But I had so much fun doing this little 10-page webcomic, because I can have Cthulhu at a desk, and I'm never gonna have the money for good prosthetic makeup to make Cthulhu doing paperwork. I'm not gonna be able to burn down New York City. I'm not gonna be able to do any kind of crazy things. And so that kind of was that first spark where I was ooh, I can actually tell stories regardless of without thinking about budget or thinking about actors. When you're in college and high school, and even right after college, it was really funny in the Park School. There was a million mafia movies, at least when I was here, and every like hardened, criminal is played by like a 19-year-old who can like barely shave, and it strains credulity ultimately, even though it's like, again, I love film noir. I made noir films that obviously do not work with children in them. And so the comic really opened up an avenue for me where you could write a screenplay, you could write a movie, quote unquote, but not be constrained by the physical realm of like, can you sew Renaissance clothing? Can you have 100 extras that you pay for that are all going to be there at the same time and fed and have health insurance for them and blah blah blah. So, and that was ultimately what happened with this, was that as it got bigger and bigger, I tried to keep it very contained. I tried to initially, the first versions of this were about a girl who was living in modern day New York City and kept having these dreams of these black strings that were kind of leading her deeper into the subways. And the twist was kind of like in Psycho, was that she was gonna die because of the entity fairly early on, at which point we would jump to a parallel timeline version of her, a different one that has, we were gonna do at least 3 different versions of this main character. And even just trying to strip down to one character, in New York City, like it was too big. And so ultimately the comic book medium kind of like welcomed me and was like, Michael, you don't have to worry about that. You can have as many characters as you want, and it can be in any time period you want. And you can invent psychedelic ayahuasca-fueled wormholes, and no one's gonna tell you no. Although Teresa was very mad at me for that for a bit. That was definitely beyond her initial wheelhouse, but I think some of her most stunning work I've ever seen, so worth it in the end.
Well, the comic book club of Ithaca and Ithacon and every other comic ever invented welcomes you to our little community. And with that, thank you for being here today. And if anybody has any further questions or wants to check out some of these amazing copies, Michael will be in our vendor's room in Emerson Suites today. Thank you so much for being here and talking to us. Yeah.
Awesome to be here. Yeah, thank you.